Welcome, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi,
U.S. History with Mr. Shaw
and Miss Willbrand.
My goodness, it's good to say that.
Lucky you.
Oh, wow. That didn't take long at all. Okay, guys, this is the first unit. We're going to go ahead and do industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. But in this video, we're just really going to talk about industrialization, which is the learning objective 1.1. Describe the causes and effects of industrialization in America and the impact it had on its workers.
Huh.
Let's get to it.
I'm excited. All right, so first up is oil. Oil is going to become a pretty dominant fuel during industrialization. We're going to kick it off in 1901 with the Spindletop discovery. Spindletop, Texas has a huge oil reserve. Oil is discovered there. Huge gusher, big deal. Look at the pictures, pretty impressive. 1,500 new oil companies spring up in 1901 because where there is a product and there is demand, you're going to need the supply. And where there's supply, you can make some money. So people see a lot of potential to get rich quick in the oil industry. So they all open their own companies, and then later we'll talk about those companies consolidating into monopolies. But we'll get there.
Well, there's so many uses for it.
There really is.
You can use it so much. Like, it's just so nice.
So nice.
They used to throw away gasoline. Did you know that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they would create kerosene out of the oil, and that's what they used to put in lanterns for light before we had electricity. And the byproduct when you make kerosene out of crude oil is petroleum. Yeah, and petroleum is gasoline, and they would just throw it away.
Idiots.
Guys, if they knew what gas prices were like today. Don't get me started. Don't get me started.
I'm sorry, go.
Oh, sorry. Mass production of steel is also going to hit big during the industrialization process. I'm seeing process and I'm saying process. There's a lot of process in my life. I'm so sorry. So the Bessemer process is invented in 1850, and this is where they find a way to heat up iron and then remove the carbon from the iron, and that creates a much stronger metal, which is steel. Before this, they would build buildings and structures with iron, which is great because iron is strong on the first level and maybe the second level, but you really couldn't go above that because iron is really brittle. And also, it rusts, so it doesn't do well out in the elements. And so you couldn't really build skyscrapers or big bridges or anything with iron because eventually it breaks down and collapses or cracks and breaks and crumbles. So with steel, we see a whole new range of inventions and buildings and a lot of new technologies pop up from that, including farming. So go ahead.
I think it's important to remember, too, that you can, these things existed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what we're kind of discovering now is, like, how to make them faster. So,
Yes.
like, steel had been around, but they didn't have an easy way to, like, get the carbon out to make it. So now with the Bessemer process, they do have an easy way to do that, and now they're going to be able to mass-produce steel, and leading to, like, skyscrapers and railroads and all kinds of cool stuff like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's what I'm here for. Oops, it didn't go. Sorry, here we go.
There
All right,
it is.
so next one is talking about inventions. So inventions are going to promote change during this time. Again, everybody knows about Thomas Edison and the light bulb. Again, he failed thousands of times trying to create a long-lasting light bulb. Finally, he does in 1880. Actually, a lot of people don't know that the Tesla Motor Company that you guys know today as a car company, it actually started out as an electric company, and they were actually competing. Nikola Tesla and then Thomas Edison were competing to create the light bulb, or a long-lasting one anyway, and Edison basically won out.
Many people think that he stole the idea from Tesla, that Tesla had it first but didn't patent it first. And some people think that Edison took it for himself. I don't know. Look into it.
Was he also a squirrel? Or we'll go back to that.
We'll get to that.
Also, during this time, we have the telephone is patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. And then the first continental phone call was in 1915. Imagine having, like, the number 1. Hey, what's your number? It's 1.
Because
You
I'm
just
the
have to
best.
dial 1. I really want that. I'm going to look into that. Also, the typewriter again is going to be a game changer because it's going to create a new demand for new jobs. And I hate to make it sound like this, but this is actually really going to open up a lot of opportunities for women.
Yes.
When we get to things like clerical work and things like that. So again, they're going to be able to create documents much faster than by handwriting them, and it's really going to change what people, I mean, the entire workplace as they knew it back then, and then eventually we'll get to computers and things like that in our day and age.
Let's go. All right, railroads. Guys, railroads are huge. They're a huge deal. We still have them today, if you haven't noticed. I always get stuck behind the one on Main Street, like, all the time. I don't know what, I would just need their schedule, I think. So railroads are going to get things to the western states, and it's going to increase demand for a national railroad network. We're going to see the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's going to be completed in 1869 in Utah is the meeting point with the Golden Spike. I'm sure you heard that in elementary school. It's a big deal.
Promontory Point.
Yes, isn't that fun? We should go there.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Right now.
Corona.
Oh. Moving on.
Sorry. New towns and markets. Railroads do open up trade as well because now you have a way to get a whole bunch of products across the country. And as things are moving across the country, you're going to see little tiny towns open up along the way because now you can drop things off and pick things up, and it's just easier to move things. Because it's easier to move big quantities of things, we see towns specializing in specific things. So before this, we really had towns kind of had to do everything themselves. So you wanted corn, you had to grow it. You wanted cotton, you had to grow it. You wanted water, you had to go find it. You had to do everything on your own, but now we can ship things from different parts of the country. So if one part of the country is better at something than another part, that's okay, because you can just ship what you're good at somewhere else. So we also see sparsely populated parts of the country beginning to grow, because as things can move, people can also move, and they're going to see new markets open up and new opportunities for jobs. So people will follow that.
One thing to point out, just to go back to what we talked about the Civil War and Reconstruction, you're not going to really notice it in this map because this is a kind of a more up-to-date map, probably later in the 1800s. But you'll see that most of the railroad systems, they're really densely populated towards the north, and that was a really big point of contention for Southerners. They wanted more, or they needed more, ways to transport their goods because they saw it as an immediate benefit for their businesses. They can transport their crops and make more money than they could, just by selling it in their own towns. But they really didn't have access to that until much later, once the railroads actually were constructed there.
Well, and especially before industrialization hits during the Civil War and Reconstruction, the North really isn't mass producing anything yet until industrialization, but the South is with those cash crops, and so they felt like they needed to be able to move them.
Perfect. All right, so we get to big business. What you need to understand about this during this time in industrialization is that they had a very favorable climate for a lot of things to happen. Basically a bunch of really random events took place to make this a really explosive time in American history with a lot of change really, really fast. The first thing was entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur is a person who organizes and operates a business. They take a little bit of a risk. If Miss Willbrand or myself, if we start our own business, we are called an entrepreneur, and we're taking a big risk because we're using our own money to kind of create this business. The reason why there were so many entrepreneurs is because we had a free enterprise economy, where companies were free to set prices and wages. That is not, again, and that is kind of a part of what's below it, which is laissez-faire capitalism, where companies conduct business without the intervention by the government. So the thing that you need to understand is that in America, we have always really had capitalism. It changes. It's changed now. It's not exactly the same that we saw it during industrialization. But in industrialization, the government just did nothing. They washed their hands of it. Laissez-faire is French for let it be, like the Beatles. Anyway, and so that's really important to know that the government basically let the businesses do whatever they want. They could set their prices, they could set their wages, which will become very important later, and they could just basically make as much money as they wanted to if they were creating enough demand for their product. So there was the biggest thing to know about this time is probably the difference between the rich and the poor. The gap between them had just skyrocketed during this time. So wealthy people wanted kind of like an explanation for why they were successful that kind of didn't make them sound horrible. Mm-hmm. And that is when we start creating the idea of social Darwinism. So Darwin was the guy who created the idea of survival of the fittest, natural selection, evolution. And so then they applied his ideas to society. And it became the social Darwinism, the theory or the philosophy of natural selection was used to justify the distribution of unequal wealth. So basically now, if you're poor, it's because you're maybe kind of stupid. Or if you're wealthy, you're more intelligent. And so basically your position in life is determined by your genetics and who you are. There was nothing happened in society necessarily that, and again, I'm using their mentality.
This is
right
social
now.
Darwinism on paper.
Yeah, nothing happened in society. Like I have no advantages. I just happen to be better than you. Is kind of like the social Darwinism description.
So the idea that if you are in like a management position or you own a business or a company, it's because you kind of deserve it because you're better than your workers.
Yeah.
You had more advantages in life. Your family was better off than the people below you, is the idea of social Darwinism. We're going to see a lot of definitions during the industrialization unit where in practice it's not really necessarily true, but on paper they really break things down into the simplest but also pretty extreme forms. So like capitalism is the idea of basically on paper free markets, no government intervention, doing what you want. But what we really see in the world is a spectrum of these things. So social Darwinism really on paper sounds awful. We see social Darwinism out in the world, but it's not so much that, oh, you have a poor job because you're stupid. Like there are a whole bunch of other extenuating circumstances that we actually see in the world outside of that.
And I would just really emphasize that this was a rich white man's description of why he was a rich white man. And so it obviously it was pretty ridiculous.
Justification at its finest.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He was justifying his own wealth. So obviously he's going to want to make himself feel good and not feel like a bad person.
Right.
So we'll get into that more later.
All right.
Well, that worked out.
That went nice. Speaking of being rich, let's talk about big business. Vertical integration versus horizontal integration. So when you own a business, you're going to want to keep being able to build that business to make even more money to maximize your profits, right? So there are a couple of different ways you can do this. I'm going to start with horizontal integration first because I think it's easier to kind of explain. So horizontal integration is the idea that you buy all of the same company. So if I own a McDonald's, I'm going to buy the McDonald's on Highway K. I'm going to buy the McDonald's on Mexico. I'm going to buy the McDonald's over by Costco. I'm going to buy all the McDonald's corporate, industry or businesses, right? Vertical integration, though, is I own a McDonald's. I'm also going to buy a cattle farm for the beef and the cheese, right? I'm going to buy a lettuce farm. I'm going to buy a tomato patch. That way I have all of the things and I don't have to pay other people for the stuff I need to go into my business. Vertical.
To be clear, she was talking about forming a monopoly. Those are two ways to form a monopoly. That's why we have the monopoly logo here.
So sorry. You already know monopoly from your vocab packets, so I assumed. You should never assume.
No
it's
worries.
a different life lesson there. All right. Eliminating competition. So businesses do create powerful strategies to dominate industries and strangle competition. Again, building monopolies. We're going to see forming trusts, things like that we'll talk about throughout this PowerPoint.
So this is just a kind of a visual of what Ms. Willbrand just talked about. Again, if you want to do horizontal integration, you're just going to buy all of the same businesses that you do. Like if like she said, McDonald's buying other McDonald's, and you would create a monopoly that way. But if you want to do vertical, you would control all of the means of production, and that would create a different type of monopoly, but still a monopoly because you don't have to pay anybody else in order to make your profits.
I love it.
So this one, I'm not a huge fan of this slide, to be honest with you guys, but it had some good stuff. So these 3 words especially are really confusing. So if you're not feeling too confident about them, our suggestion would be to probably write them down and just keep referring back to them. And again, you guys have access to this PowerPoint or this Google Slides, so you absolutely can just refer back to it if you'd like. But we wanted to just take some time and talk about the new ways to organize a business. So Ms. Willbrand already talked about a monopoly, so I'm not going to talk about that one, but I will talk about the corporation and the trust. So corporation is a business owned by investors who buy part of the company through shares or stock, and selling the stock is a way for the business owners to raise money to invest back into the company. So if I start a company, okay, and I need more money to make my company better, what I can do is I can make my company public. Okay, and then I can sell stock to Ms. Willbrand. Let's say I sell stock to all of the social studies teachers, and they buy 100% of the stock in my company. So now Ms. Willbrand owns 10%, Ms. Womack owns 10%, Ms. Wilson owns 10%, and they collectively own my company. But I still technically run it but I now can use their money to make my company better, and that's what a corporation is. And a trust is similar to a corporation. However, what you're gonna see in a trust is different companies are going to kind of organize into a corporation, and they so basically imagine like a McDonald's, a Taco Bell, and like a Jack in the Box, okay, and they are, they're going to form one company together, one corporation that is going to be owned separately and operated separately, but now that whoever's organizing it and operating it, they are going to be they own it now, but the other 3 can still operate on their own. Trusts are really confusing. And I did just a pretty terrible job of describing it. You don't have to nod there.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
But there's no easy way to explain it.
Right. There's not.
Instead of people buying stock, it's more like other competing companies buying stock, like pooling together to control the market. Would you say that? I
would agree with that. And I think that the thing you need to remember about a trust is that it's kind of a way that people use to get around a monopoly. So if once the government steps in and starts trying to break up monopolies, people start the owners of these companies start to form trusts. So they say, "Oh, I don't own it. It's the trust. The trustees, the board of trustees are the ones that operate it. It's not me." And so.
No.
We'll talk about this a lot more in class because this is probably the most confusing thing about this unit. But again, just keep that in mind right now. A trust is just a way to get around a monopoly where ownership is kind of being transferred to kind of keep the government at bay.
Yeah. The whole purpose of this is to get around, with trusts and corporations, is to get around government restrictions on monopolies, which we'll talk more about
right now. So the concerns about big business is that it's going to allow us to have an improved standard of living. Again, the things you see during this industrialization age they're insane. People are going to be living better. People are going to have more access to cars with mass production and things like that. So the overall standard of living is going to be really, really great if you're white and wealthy, most likely.
Yeah. That social Darwinism, if you're doing well in the social Darwinism spectrum.
Yeah, and that's kind of a thing that we need to make sure we clarify is that things are going great usually if you're white. income inequality was rising, that gap between the rich and the poor that I mentioned, and expanding corporations are going to stifle free competition. So if the more monopolies that are created, like if Miss Willbrand and I own a company and we have a monopoly, say, over fast food, okay, and if you want fast food, you have to go to our company, we can charge whatever we want for our prices if you have no other options. And so that's part of the reason why people were so afraid of these monopolies and these big businesses becoming monopolies, because they really couldn't stop them from setting prices at whatever they wanted or creating less quality products.
And to an extent, first of all, let me say there are a lot more government regulations on companies today, but to an extent you do see these monopolies in small towns with like cable companies where there's only one option for cable or for TV, especially where internet isn't always an option. We see it also for like trash companies and water companies. Like out where I live, we have one electric company. I don't have an option. They technically could charge whatever they want because I need electricity. Like I have to be able to watch my Netflix.
Makes sense.
I'm going to pay them whatever they want.
So one way to kind of deal with these trusts and these monopolies that were forming was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It was the first kind of attempt to start controlling them. So this made it illegal to form a trust that interfered with free trade, meaning that companies that could raise or lower prices or give out less quality products or sell less quality products because they had a monopoly. It prohibited monopolies and other activities that hindered competition. Again, when companies compete, usually the prices are lower, which is better for us, the buyers. The problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act was that it had a lot of loopholes, it had a lot of vague language, and it basically didn't do anything. So it prohibited monopolies, but companies were allowed to continue because it lacked a lot of teeth, a lot of bite to actually get rid of these trusts and monopolies.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about working conditions. So going back to social Darwinism, these are for the people on the not so favorable end of that, right? So people would work 6 to 7 day work weeks, 12 or more hours a day, especially after we get electricity, because then you can just work as long as you want to because there's light. There's no vacation, there's no sick time, there's no unemployment compensation, there's no reimbursement for injuries. Wages are barely livable, which means that they barely make enough to feed their families or themselves or pay rent. Usually the conditions in the factories were dirty, poorly ventilated, which is, if you've ever been in or around a factory, not safe, and not really up to any kind of code because there weren't any. Also, tasks were pretty repetitive and mind-dulling, so people would fatigue quickly in those tasks and then make mistakes, but because conditions were dangerous, those mistakes could cost you a finger, an arm, your life. So it just really wasn't unsafe at all. So some statistics for you: 675 people died in work-related accidents each week in 1882. In 1899, women averaged $267 a year, while men averaged $498 a year. Women were thought to need to make less because they didn't provide for their families like men do. If women needed to provide for their family, they'd go marry a man. And then the man would provide. And so it was thought that women didn't need to make as much. Plus, somebody needed to be home with the kids. In the rare circumstances in the early 1800s where both families work, children were just left at young ages home alone or were brought to the factories with their parents and put to work sweeping or doing something unsafe, which is usually for even less than women, if any pay at all. In 1900, Andrew Carnegie made $23 million. Of that gives you some comparison on that spectrum that we were talking about.
So this leads to the rise of labor unions. So people, what they're going to do is they're going to call it's going to be called something called collective bargaining. And basically, each individual worker really doesn't have a lot of power. But if they work together and they form a union, they band together, they actually do have a lot of power, because if they walk out or they start a strike, they can basically keep the management, the owners, from making any money for that day or week or month or whatever. So that's really powerful. So union officials are going to start representing the workers. They are going to negotiate with management for better hours, better, higher wages, shorter hours, and in general, better working conditions. And if the negotiation fails, a lot of times workers could strike or boycott to try to support the union demands. These unions, and I can just continue going because I think it keeps going here. The unions are really going to scare a lot of people. They're going to scare workers, or they're not workers, they're going to scare the owners because they're not going to be able to make as much money. And profits are really kind of the main goal right now if you're an entrepreneur or a business owner. And also, unions it kind of gets this started towards socialism, and the socialism is an economic and political system where the government controls part of businesses and property, and then it also kind of helps get more towards equal distribution of wealth. I don't necessarily like that it says equal there. That's that's closer to communism. But in socialism, they try to minimize the rich-poor gap.
Again, this is all a spectrum, so.
Which we'll talk about more in class. So anyway, the strikes are going, basically owners are going to start locking out workers. They're going to start hiring scabs to try to work instead of the workers. And then the workers are going to get angry. The strikes are going to turn violent, and it's really going to lead to just a lot of really unfortunate situations. So the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike, again, I don't know necessarily. We're going to talk about the Homestead strike in class with an activity that we do. Just basically what you need to know is that wages are going to get cut or people are going to be laid off. People go on strike, and the owners are going to try to put that strike down and get people back to work by any means necessary, sometimes using violence, sometimes calling in like the Pinkertons, which is like a private police force, sometimes calling in the military. So there's all kinds of things that are going to happen, and it's just really an unfortunate situation when they probably just needed to sit down and talk it out.
That's all you need to do sometimes. All right, so management. Management is going to fire union members. They're going to forbid union meetings, and they're going to have people sign yellow dog contracts. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, yellow dog contracts basically is a contract where you cannot, you agree to not join a labor union. And so basically you're agreeing, if you take this job and you sign a yellow dog contract, you are agreeing to not be represented by a union, which means that the owners have more, basically can, raise or lower your wages or fire you or, do whatever without having to worry about a union.
So we still see these contracts today. Businesses still can make that choice to not allow unions or union members. So when you go out into the workforce here in a few years and you go to get a job, maybe this is something you want to look into, because I know some grocery stores ban them. There are a lot of different industries that ban them. Again, we've already kind of talked about the Sherman Act being used against workers. The government claims that strikes interfere with business and trade. Of course they do, because when people strike, it shuts down the business, which the government doesn't love, because if there's no business and there's no trade, then there are no taxes on the products being sold.
Well, and also, like, if a labor union negotiates higher wages or lesser hours, that means less money for the company, which means the economy as a whole is going to be making less money. Yes. And again, it's a whole big thing. We'll get into it more with Unit 2, which is really interesting, like kind of the balancing act of the economy versus like people's rights.
Because as we move through industrialization, we're going to see the government step in more and more and more, which is Unit 2, them stepping in and trying to fix all of these problems that we were talking about that spring up from a whole bunch of growth really, really quickly in America. And then, of course, labor unions. Workers do continue to join labor unions. We see more labor unions pop up. In 1904, the AFL has 1,700,000 members. It climbs to over 2 million by 1916, which is pretty quick. And today we still see labor unions in most companies. So like there are teacher unions, nurses unions, grocery stores have unions, tons of any kind of labor intensive work, like floor layers, painting, plumbing, those all usually have unions as well. So
guys, that'll do it for us. Under 30 minutes too.
We did it!
Nice work.
It's amazing.
See you next time.
Bye.